So, for example, during the uprisings in the Arab world, say Egypt, Tahrir Square, it was surprisingly little sectarianism. There were many different points of view, but there was a unity and a common goal, and it's beginning to fall apart, unfortunately. So just yesterday, there was a women's demonstration calling for women's rights. It was attacked it's a very sexist society, and the women were attacked and driven out. Okay, that's sectarianism. There's now also religious sectarianism developing. I mean, when a common goal is no longer sort of uniting people in a struggle, then you do get sectarianism. And that's the way to bring people together. So, for example, in the labor movement, the American, say in the United States, same elsewhere, but in the United States, the labor has often been extremely racist. Not necessarily just against blacks. For example, Irish in the late 19th century were treated very much like blacks. I mean, you could walk around Boston and see signs saying no dogs or Irish allowed, and so on. What were called Huns, that meant anybody from Eastern Europe. Bitter racism against the Huns, against the Italians, it goes all the way back. But when the strike waves began in the late 19th century, and they really became significant in places like the coal and steel centers in western Pennsylvania, working for people took over cities and ran them. At that point, the sectarianism disappeared, the racism disappeared. There was unity to achieve something. And the same was true in CIO organizing in the 1930s. It overcame, black racism against blacks. They worked together. That's the only way to do it that I know. Same happened in the civil rights movement. If you've got a common goal, then you can combine in trying to achieve it. Then sectarian efforts are marginalized. They don't disappear. There's still people hanging around the periphery. And maybe if the motive and commitment declines, they may begin to take over, as we're beginning to see in Egypt. But I don't know of any other way to do it.
Next question is from Paul Laverty, close associate to Ken Loach and also award-winning screenwriter. There has probably never been a time where there has been such concentration of wealth and power in so few hands. The powerful are sophisticated in maintaining this state of affairs, but perhaps we use this too as an excuse to hide our shortcomings on the left. What do you think has been lacking in our imaginative effort to build a mass international campaign to democratize resources and challenge corporate power? Can you imagine a time where we can organize our lives and economies successfully on a cooperative basis instead than a competitive one?
Certainly can imagine it, and in fact there have been successful experiments with it, some of them right now. None of them are utopia, none of them are what I or you or others would aspire to, but they're not insignificant. Like, take, say, the Mondragon system in Spain. It's not worker-managed, but it's worker-owned. It's a form of cooperative, quite successful, very broad, lots of problems, but quite real. If you look around the United States, there are probably hundreds of self-managed enterprises, not huge. Some of them are pretty large, but huge. They're successful. Take, say, Egypt right now. One of the interesting things that's happening in Egypt is that the labor movement, which has been very militant for years, as I mentioned, this is not an uprising out of nothing. They've now apparently, it's hard to get information because it's not covered very well, but actually I think Amira Hass has been reporting this, that in some of the industrial centers, like again the Mahala big industrial center, apparently workers have taken over the enterprises and are managing them themselves. Well, if that's true, that would be the beginning of a revolution. Go back to John Berger's words. So yes, it's certainly feasible. What's been lacking, the comment about the inequality is very real. I don't know the detailed statistics for other countries, but in the United States, where I know it, inequality is back to the highest level it's ever been in history, the 1920s. But that's misleading, because the inequality in the United States is highly concentrated. It's mostly in the top fraction of 1% of the population. You take a look at the income distribution, it goes very sharply up towards the high end, and literally 1/10 of 1% of the population now has extraordinary wealth. In fact, that's driving the inequality. If you take that part away, it's unequal, but not totally out of sight. Who are they? They're hedge fund managers, CEOs, bankers, and so on. Well, something quite significant has been happening. Since the 1970s, the economy has changed significantly. It's been financialized. Go back to, say, 1970, financial institutions, banks, investment firms, were a small percentage of corporate profits. At the peak, now, in 2007, they reached 40%. They don't benefit the economy. In fact, they probably harm the economy. There's no central social utility to them, but they're powerful. And with economic power, comes political power, pretty obvious reasons. So they have gained extensive political power. For example, it was financial institutions that put Obama into office pretty much. That's where most of his funding came from. With political power comes the opportunity to modify the legislative system, and they've been doing it. So since the late 1980s mainly, fiscal policies have been changed, say tax policies, to ensure rapid concentration, very high concentration of wealth. Rules of corporate governance have been changed. They allow, for example, the CEO of a corporation to select the board that determines his salary. Well, you can imagine what the consequences of that are. Actually, you read them in the front pages of the newspapers every day about the huge bonuses being given to management. That's where that comes from. The regulation has collapsed with very striking effects. New Deal regulation. Incidentally, this generalizes to the rest of the world. I'm talking about the United States because I know it better. New Deal regulation prevented any financial crises up until the 1980s, really. 1970s, it started to be dismantled. Since the 1980s, crisis after crisis, several during the Reagan years, pretty serious ones. In fact, Reagan left office with the worst financial crisis since the Depression, the savings and loan, then came Clinton and the tech crisis, then finally this housing crisis, $8 trillion of fake money disappeared, devastating the economy. Well, all of these are political decisions. And meanwhile, the cost of campaigning went way up. And that compels the parties to climb pretty deep into the pockets of the corporate sector. That's where the money is. The next election, 2012, is expected to cost about $2 billion. And you take a look at the Obama administration, you notice he's staffing the government right now with executives. They're the ones who have the access to the corporate funding that's going to buy the election. Elections are just becoming farces, run by public relations industry, their marketing efforts, and they kind of say it openly. But in fact, Obama won the award from the advertising industry for the best marketing campaign of 2008. They know exactly what's going on. Well, all of this is a kind of a vicious cycle. Increased concentration of wealth, increased political power. It acts to further increase wealth. Why is there no reaction? Actually, there is a reaction. Right now, for the first time, what's going on in Wisconsin is a very significant reaction. There are tens of thousands of people in the streets, day after day, with a lot of popular support, maybe 2/3 of the population supporting them. They're trying to defend labor rights, the right of collective bargaining, which is under attack. I mean, the business world understands very well that the one barrier to this total corporate tyranny is the organized workers' movement. So that's got to be destroyed. Labor history in the United States has been extremely violent, more so than in Europe. And there's been effort after effort to wipe out the unions. They keep reviving. Now is a major one going on, but it's being resisted. It's being resisted by large popular movements. Well, where's the left? Actually, what's happened to the left is interesting. Since the 1960s, when there was a big revival, there is quite an activist left. There are more young activists now than there were in the 60s, but the issues have changed. The issues are what are sometimes called post-materialist. They're important issues. Don't denigrate them. So gay rights, environmental rights, women's rights, they're all really important things. But they don't reach to the concerns of the people who are living under depression-level unemployment. They don't reach to the 20% of the population, roughly, who need food stamps. There hasn't been that kind of outreach and organizing. So when the protests started in Wisconsin a couple of weeks ago, there was practically no left initiative. I mean, a couple of well-known figures came in to give talks, but it was not organized by the left groups who ought to be right at the heart of it. It's there, and it better come, or else we're in bad trouble. But while left activism is significant, very significant, it's pretty much divorced from the daily struggles for survival and a decent life of most of the population. And that's a gap that has to be overcome somehow.
Last question is from Alice Walker, award-winning author. I believe that a one-state solution to the Palestine-Israel impasse is inevitable, and more than just a two-state solution could ever be. This is because I don't believe Israel will ever give up trying to control Palestinians, whether citizens of Israel or those living in the occupied territories. Under a two-state solution, there would be Israel and a Palestinian Bantustan. I have been struck by your dismissal of the one-state idea as something almost absurd, and would like to understand why you see it this way. Is there no hope that Israelis and Palestinians might live together as white and black people do after the fall of apartheid in South Africa?
It's an interesting question. She's a wonderful woman, does fine work. She's really committed to the Palestinian cause. But the question tells you something about the recent Palestine solidarity movement. I mean, if I had asked her, let's say, why do you think it's absurd to try to advocate for civil rights for blacks in the United States, she'd be nonplussed. She's devoted a lot of her life to that. In fact, the only possible response would be, what planet are you coming from? That's what I've been doing all my life. That's exactly the same here. It's now about 70 years that I've been advocating for what in the recent reincarnation is called a one-state settlement. A one-state settlement, notice, not solution. A one-state settlement used to be called a binational settlement. And if you think about it, yes, it'll have to be binational settlement. So that's what I was when I was a young activist in the 1940s, opposed to a Jewish state. That was what we were struggling for, a binational state, a one-state settlement. And that's continued without a break. And it's kind of hard to miss. Since the 1960s, a series of books, huge number of articles, constant talks all the time, thousands of them, interviews, all the same, trying to work for a binational settlement, opposition to a Jewish state. Done a ton of work on this, activist work, writing, and so on. But it's not just a slogan, and I think that's why somebody like Alice Walker doesn't know it. It's not just a slogan, let's all live together happily. It's trying to look at the problem seriously. If you're serious about it, you ask, how do we get there? You ask, what are the steps that'll take us there? Not just, wouldn't it be nice if we had peace? That's easy. How do we get there? Well, that depends on circumstances, like all tactical choices. So in the pre-1948 period, it was straightforward. It said, we don't want a Jewish state. Let's have a binational state. 48 to 67, you couldn't sensibly take that position. You're talking to yourself. In 1967, it opened up again. There was an opportunity in 67 to move towards some kind of a federal system, which could then proceed further to closer integration, maybe become a true binational secular state. And in fact, at that time, 67 on, I was writing about it all over the place. Like I said, books, articles, interviews, and so on. Up till about 1975. 1975, Palestinian nationalism crystallized and appeared on the agenda, and the PLO turned to a two-state settlement, the huge, overwhelming international consensus by that time for two-state settlement in the form that everyone knows. 67 to 75, it was possible to advocate for it directly, and it was anathema, hated, denounced, because it was threatening. It was threatening because it could be fulfilled, and that would harm policy formation. So, if it was noticed at all, it was denounced and vilified. 75 on, you can still maintain the position, but you have to face reality. It's going to have to be achieved in stages. And there's only one proposal that I've ever heard, other than, let's all live in peace together. The one proposal that I know is, if I had to listen if there's another one, is begin with the international consensus, two-state settlement. It would reduce the level of violence, cycle of violence. It would open up possibilities for a closer interaction, which already to some extent takes place, even in today's circumstances, commercial, cultural, other forms of interaction. That could lead to erosion of boundaries. It could move on to closer integration, and maybe something like the old concept of a binational state. Now, I called it a settlement because I don't think that's the end of the road. I don't see any particular reason to worship imperialist boundaries. So, like when I was, my wife and I, back when we were students, were backpacking up in northern Israel and happened to cross into Lebanon because there's no marked border. Somebody finally yelled at us and said, you better get back. But why should there be a border there? It was imposed by British and French violence. You should move towards a closer integration of the whole region. No state settlement, if you want the word. And there's plenty wrong with states anyway. Why should we worship state structures? They should be eroded. So it's a step, it's a series of steps. Now, if anyone can think of another way to get there, then they ought to tell us. We could listen to it and talk about it. But I don't know of any other way. So what you end up with, at least I end up with, what I've been writing and speaking about, is something that's too complex to put on a Twitter message. And in this age, that means it doesn't exist. You have to support both the two-state and the one-state solution. Settlement, not solution. You support both of them, because one of them is the path to getting to the other. If you don't make the first move, you're not going to get anywhere. Now, Alice Walker says Israel won't accept a two-state settlement. Yeah, she's right. A fortiori is not going to accept the one-state settlement. So if that argument has any force, her proposal is out the window, mine too. And by the same argument, you could show there could never be an end to apartheid. White nationalists would never accept an end to apartheid, which was true. Okay, therefore let's give up the anti-apartheid struggle. Indonesia would never give up East Timor. In fact, the generals said so loudly. It's our province, we're going to keep it. And that would have been true if actions were taken in a vacuum. But they're not taken in a vacuum. There are other factors involved. And one factor, which is significant, and in fact in these cases decisive, is U.S. policy. Well, that's not graven in stone. When U.S. policy shifted on Indonesia and East Timor, it literally took one phrase from President Clinton to get the Indonesian generals out. At one point he said, it's over. They withdrew. In the case of apartheid, it's a little more complicated. Cuba played a big role. Cuba drove South Africans out of Namibia, for example, and protected Angola and so on. That had a big impact. But it was when the U.S. changed policy around 1990, there was a change of policy. It was at that point that apartheid collapsed. Now, in the case of Israel, it's just the U.S. is decisive. I mean, Israel can't do anything except what the U.S. supports. It gives diplomatic, military, economic, ideological support. If that prop is pulled out, they do what the U.S. says. In fact, that's happened over and over. So yes, it's true that if they were acting in a vacuum, they'd never accept anything but what they're now doing. Taking over Gaza prison, take over as much of the occupied territories as you want. They'll continue. But they're not acting in a vacuum. There are things we can do, as in other cases, to change it. And in that case, I think you can consider and even lay out a plan for a move towards a one-state settlement as a step towards something even better, which can go on. But as far as I can see, the only way to do that is by supporting the international consensus as a first step. A step to be a prelude to further steps. And that means very concrete actions. We don't have to talk about, we don't have to have a seminar in which we discuss abstract possibilities. There are very concrete moves that can be made. So for example, withdrawal of the IDF, the Israeli army, from the West Bank. That's a concrete proposal. And there are steps that can be taken to implement it. For example, Amnesty International, which is hardly a revolutionary organization, called for an arms embargo on Israel. Well, if the United States and Britain, France, others could be, if the public could compel the governments to accept that proposal as an arms embargo unless you pull your army out of the West Bank, that would have an effect. Other actions can too. If the army's pulled out of the West Bank, the settlers are going to go with them. They'll climb into the lorries provided to them and move from their subsidized homes in the West Bank to subsidized homes in Israel, just like they did in Gaza when they got the order. Some will probably remain, but that's okay. They want to remain in a Palestinian state. That's their business. So there are quite concrete things that can be done. It's not going to be like snapping your fingers, but not beyond the kinds of things that have happened elsewhere when policy of the great powers changed, primarily the U.S.
Professor Chomsky, thank you very much.